Africa speaks back. The voice, the truth, the continent on its own terms.
Africa has spoken. Now pass it on. Subscribe, like, share.
For decades, Burkina Faso was a name you'd only hear when things went wrong. A failed state, a forgotten zone, another statistic on someone else's report. But that silence, it was never emptiness. It was pressure, building. While the world looked away, a different story began to form. No Western funding, no consultants, no flashy slogans, just steel, fire, and the will to build. And at the center of it all, a soldier turned builder. Ibrahim Traoré didn't launch his presidency with global tours or billion-dollar promises. He walked into an abandoned warehouse and said 8 words that would change everything. We will build our future with our hands. No one took it seriously. Some laughed, some didn't even bother to report it. But now, that same factory is exporting a product the world didn't expect and quietly needs. A boiler, a tool, a symbol made in Burkina Faso. This isn't a feel-good piece. It's a reminder. Real power doesn't always come from headlines. Sometimes it starts with heat. If you believe truth has more value than trends, subscribe. If you believe impact speaks louder than image, share. Let's begin. Not from the top, but from the ground, where the story truly started. We're not here to explain greatness. We're here to trace the steps of how it began. It didn't start with a factory. It started with a failure. When Ibrahim Traoré stepped into power, he didn't inherit a nation. He walked into the aftermath of everything that didn't work. The treasury was empty, schools were broken, doctors were underpaid or gone. The youth, the heartbeat of the country, had stopped believing in their own soil. And maybe the hardest thing to rebuild wasn't infrastructure. It was trust. People weren't protesting, they were packing, leaving. Not because they didn't love their country, but because it no longer loved them back. So what do you do when your people no longer expect anything good to come from home? Some might call it rock bottom, but maybe that's also where clarity begins. Because when you've lost everything, the question shifts from what do we have to what do we actually need? And in Burkina Faso, the answers weren't flashy. Not 5G, not high-speed trains, not billion-dollar satellites. They needed food that cooked faster, fuel that didn't run out, a way for mothers to breathe while making dinner. That's not a metaphor. That's how this started. Most people don't know this, but over 80% of households in Burkina Faso still cook over open flame. That means smoke. Every meal, every day. It means lung disease at 35. It means firewood over school books. It means time lost, breath stolen, futures cut short. We think technology looks like apps and drones, but what if innovation is also the right kind of heat in the right kind of hands? Before Rasco Baba ever became a product, it was a problem no one else was willing to solve. And maybe that's the real difference here. Other leaders looked outward. Traoré looked inward, then downward. Not at power, at people. He didn't ask what would impress the world. He asked, what can we fix today that changes tomorrow? That question led to a warehouse. That warehouse to a boiler. And that boiler, well, it wasn't about the machine. It was about giving people something to believe in again. Something they could touch, use, and say, we made this. Not theory, not promises, just function. Maybe we all underestimate what people can build when they're given the tools, the time, and just enough room to try. Because once the first spark hits steel, everything begins to change. Some say real revolutions come with noise, but sometimes they begin with the hum of welding and the sound of no one leaving. You'd expect a big moment, a speech, a camera, maybe some ribbon cutting with foreign press invited, but it didn't happen like that. The first real move in this so-called industrial miracle was Ibrahim Traoré walking into a warehouse that smelled like rust and silence and saying simply, start here. There were no machines, no skilled staff, not even proper electricity, just dust, old blueprints, and a vision that didn't require permission. This wasn't policy, it was posture. It was the difference between waiting for the world to notice and building something so real the world would have to look. We often think rebuilding a country starts with big speeches or big aid, but maybe it starts with someone picking up a wrench before they ever pick up a microphone. And here's where it gets interesting. He didn't call the French. He didn't call Washington. He called Ghana. He called Mali, and people came. Not with cash, but with calloused hands. Former taxi drivers, farmers who'd never seen a factory floor, young engineers who had once dreamed of Berlin or Paris, now wiring panels in Ouagadougou. What would happen if people stopped leaving their countries because they saw something worth staying for? Not just jobs, but pride. We think patriotism is about flags and slogans, but maybe it's also this: building something that doesn't need translation. The first machines were secondhand. Parts came slowly, mistakes were made and made again, but no one quit. One welder said, "I've never worked on anything that wasn't for someone else. This is ours." And it shows. Because by the third month, the first Rasco Baba prototype rolled out, steam-tested, locally forged, made not in theory, but in sweat. This wasn't charity. It was dignity in assembly line form. And that kind of dignity is louder than any campaign. So ask yourself this: if one boiler built by hands that were once unemployed can feed families across borders, what else could we build if we finally stopped asking for permission to begin? If you're still here watching, you're part of the small percentage that pays attention before the world catches up. So do us a favor, send this to someone who thinks African industry is a myth. Not to argue, just to let them see. Because the world doesn't change with opinions. It changes with examples. The sound of machines turning on for the first time is easy to miss, but it means the waiting is over. The Rasco Baba wasn't sleek. It wasn't sexy. It didn't have a logo that trended on Twitter, but it worked. And suddenly, the question wasn't, can we build this? It became, what if the rest of the world actually wants what we're building? Because when a boiler designed for village homes started showing up in European golf resorts, people stopped laughing. Not because of hype, but because performance doesn't lie. Chefs in Ghana started swapping out imported cookware for Rasco units. A hotel in Lisbon posted a photo of its kitchen staff holding one like it was a trophy. A restaurant in Qatar reordered 50 units after just 2 weeks. Even a Swedish culinary school asked to tour the factory. What changed? Nothing flashy, just function, just proof. And while the product traveled quietly across borders, inside Burkina Faso, something deeper started moving. A generation that once believed their country had nothing to offer now saw something they made in the hands of someone halfway across the planet. For years, people were told, you have potential. Now they had evidence. We think pride comes from big parades, flags waving in the wind, but sometimes it comes from walking into your neighbor's house, seeing the Rasco Baba on their stove, and realizing yours was built on the same line by someone who lives down your street. It's not nationalism, it's ownership. And with that ownership came momentum. Small forges opened on the outskirts of towns. Youth centers shifted from foreign language tutoring to welding courses. Packaging stations popped up in markets that used to sell imported tins. Some asked, but how long will this last? Fair question. But maybe that's the wrong lens. The real story isn't how long it lasts, it's what it replaces. Before Rasco Baba, time was burned in smoke. Now families cook in half the time. Before, girls skip school to gather firewood. Now they eat before the sun sets. And maybe most powerful of all, people stopped calling it the President's Project. They started calling it ours. We think transformation needs to be televised, but what if it's enough that it's happening? If that speaks to you, send this to someone who's never heard of Burkina Faso, but believes small nations have big ideas. Not for sympathy, for clarity. Progress doesn't always look like breaking news. Sometimes it's just a shift you can feel, like when the air clears and for the first time in years, people can breathe while they cook. The Rasco Baba wasn't sleek. It wasn't sexy. It didn't have a logo that trended on Twitter, but it worked. And suddenly, the question wasn't, can we build this? It became, what if the rest of the world actually wants what we're building? Because when a boiler designed for village homes started showing up in European golf resorts, people stopped laughing. Not because of hype, but because performance doesn't lie. Chefs in Ghana started swapping out imported cookware for Rasco units. A hotel in Lisbon posted a photo of its kitchen staff holding one like it was a trophy. A restaurant in Qatar reordered 50 units after just 2 weeks. Even a Swedish culinary school asked to tour the factory. What changed? Nothing flashy, just function, just proof. And while the product traveled quietly across borders, inside Burkina Faso, something deeper started moving. A generation that once believed their country had nothing to offer now saw something they made in the hands of someone halfway across the planet. For years, people were told, "You have potential." Now they had evidence. We think pride comes from big parades, flags waving in the wind, but sometimes it comes from walking into your neighbor's house, seeing the Rasco Baba on their stove, and realizing yours was built on the same line by someone who lives down your street. It's not nationalism, it's ownership. And with that ownership came momentum. Small forges opened on the outskirts of towns. Youth centers shifted from foreign language tutoring to welding courses. Packaging stations popped up in markets that used to sell imported tins. Some asked, but how long will this last? Fair question. But maybe that's the wrong lens. The real story isn't how long it lasts, it's what it replaces. Before Rasco Baba, time was burned in smoke. Now, families cook in half the time. Before, girls skip school to gather firewood. Now they eat before the sun sets. And maybe most powerful of all, people stopped calling it the President's Project. They started calling it ours. We think transformation needs to be televised, but what if it's enough that it's happening? If that speaks to you, send this to someone who's never heard of Burkina Faso, but believes small nations have big ideas. Not for sympathy, for clarity. Progress doesn't always look like breaking news. Sometimes it's just a shift you can feel, like when the air clears and, for the first time in years, people can breathe while they cook. Success always gets attention, but it also gets resistance, and Rasco Baba was starting to get both. 6 months in, after local and regional orders surged, something unexpected happened. 2 major European cookware brands filed intellectual property claims. Accusations of patent violations, alleged design overlap, whispers of unregulated exports. On the surface, it looked like legal noise, but in practice, it was disruption. Shipments delayed, ports requesting sudden safety checks, some suppliers pulling out quietly. Burkina Faso's trade team had seen this play before. When something new works too well, old systems start checking your paperwork a little harder. But here's what didn't happen. The factory didn't slow down. They doubled production, because something deeper had already taken root, a national stake. What began as a manufacturing experiment had become emotional infrastructure. People weren't just buying boilers, they were defending them. On social media, families posted photos beside their units, not in praise, but in protest. Signs read, "This is our pride. This is our power." At universities, students ran breakdown sessions explaining the steam dynamics of Rasco's design, not just to study, but to defend. Even village musicians began writing songs about it. You can laugh. But in places where war once dictated the rhythm of daily life, having music about metal and fire that doesn't destroy, that means something. And all of this raises a bigger question. If a product built by local hands sparks this kind of loyalty, what else have we been taught to underestimate? Before Rasco Baba, most people didn't know what Burkina Faso exported. Now people from Dubai to Dakar were placing custom orders. Not out of charity, but performance. That's a shift. One hotel in Muscat switched to Rasco units after a month-long trial. A university in Belgium requested a small batch to test in student dorms. Even a high-end chef in Seoul posted about the surprising consistency of the steam flow. Not bad for a project that started in a warehouse without working lights. And yet, with growth came pressure. Not just from the outside, but the inside too. Some advisors suggested compromise, licensing deals, foreign partnerships to protect the future. But Traore said no. We don't need permission to succeed. That's what he told the press. And it wasn't a soundbite, it was policy. Burkina Faso would not sell equity in Rasco Baba. Instead, it opened an innovation fund, exclusively for African engineers. Within weeks, local developers submitted upgraded models, solar-assisted heating, rural school-friendly formats, even collapsible versions for mobile clinics. And this is where the story turns again, because now it wasn't just a product, it was a framework, a system of design, ownership, loyalty, and most importantly, belief. Not imported, not borrowed. Ours. If someone had told us 2 years ago that Burkina Faso would design a piece of kitchen equipment that made European brands nervous, we wouldn't have laughed. We just wouldn't have believed it was possible. But that's the thing about belief. Once it returns, it doesn't ask permission. It builds quietly, and then all at once. It was never just about making dinner easier. It was about reclaiming time. And with time, everything else starts to shift. Before Rasco Baba, a mother in rural Burkina Faso might spend 5 hours a day cooking over smoke. Now she spends less than 2. That's 3 hours returned to her life. 3 hours not chasing firewood, not coughing, not wiping tears from burning eyes. What do you think that kind of time does to a home, to a child growing up in it? Children started getting healthier. Grandparents stopped wheezing. Mealtime changed. It used to be survival. Now it was connection. One boy told a local news crew, "Before my mom's hands were always black. Now she smiles when she cooks." That's not a PR line. That's a moment. And there were thousands like it. We tend to underestimate what small machines can move, but a boiler that clears the air, that brings back time, that might do more than any policy ever could, because once something works, people start organizing around it, not just emotionally, but structurally. In towns where people once waited for aid trucks, they were now forming co-ops. Mothers who used to cook alone began batch cooking for neighbors. Mechanics set up mobile Rasco repair hubs. Local builders adapted kitchens to better fit the units. It spread, not just as product, but as pattern. A different way to live, to work, to measure value. We think economics is about GDP and debt ceilings. But what if real economics also lives in how much time a person has to breathe between tasks, to laugh while cooking, to plan the next thing instead of surviving the current one? That's not soft data. That's structure. And structure is contagious. By year 2, Rasco Baba wasn't just supporting jobs inside the factory, it was supporting over 4,000 workers across the ecosystem. Transporters, logistics crews, packaging teams, metal forges, quality inspectors, training centers. Some were earning more than they made in a decade. Not because the market exploded, but because they were building something that didn't disappear after the photo op. So what happens when pride is no longer theoretical? What happens when your paycheck comes from your neighbor's stove? This was never just about local production. It was about building a reason not to leave. In a world telling people to find opportunity, Burkina Faso quietly started proving. Sometimes the opportunity is right where you are, if someone dares to build it. If this part of the story feels different, if it makes you pause, share it. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's quietly working. And maybe that's what we need more of right now. The fire was no longer just under the pot. It was under the people. Factories usually build machines, but sometimes they build people. The Rasco Baba project didn't just hire workers. It redefined what work could mean. Inside those assembly lines, something rare started happening. People didn't just clock in. They grew. And for many, it was the first time anyone had expected them to. Welders who once worked odd jobs were promoted to supervisors. Women with zero industrial experience ran quality control floors. Youth who thought their only future was in migration started teaching vocational skills to others. No one handed them that path. They built it. And it's hard to explain just how much that changes a person until you've seen the look on someone's face when they say, "I make something the world wants." That's not ego, that's grounding. We think development is measured in miles of highway or megawatts produced, but maybe it also lives in the fact that someone who used to survive now leads a team. And when that shift spreads, the politics shift too. Local governments started getting uncomfortable, but not from protests, from questions. Where's our boiler station? Why hasn't our region joined the network? Can we get a training program here? The pressure wasn't top-down anymore. It was grassroots. It came from people who had touched something real and now refused to accept anything less. That's political reform without the speeches. Change not through noise, but through expectation. What would happen if we stopped waiting for leadership from the top and started building pressure from the ground? That's what Rasco Baba triggered. No one had to organize a movement. The movement was the machines. Each unit shipped became a reminder. We can make this. So why haven't we made more? And when citizens start asking that, not in anger, but in clarity, governments listen, or they get replaced. In a country long shaped by outside intervention, this was something no outsider could replicate. A population that had seen too many broken programs was now protecting the one thing they built themselves. You could feel it in villages where local farmers donated food to factory teams. You could see it in the murals of school children, where instead of soldiers or saints, they drew boilers. Not as machines, but as symbols, because in a place that had known instability for decades, the most radical thing wasn't resistance. It was reliability. Burkina Faso wasn't chasing perfection. It was building proof, and that's something no headline can fake. The system didn't change because of a miracle. It changed because people stopped waiting for one. At first glance, it was just another kitchen tool. Stainless steel, pressure valve, steam release, functional, familiar, forgettable. But the world was wrong. Because what came out of that boiler wasn't just steam, it was proof. Proof that a country written off as fragile could design, produce, export, and lead. Proof that industrial strength doesn't always show up in skyscrapers, but sometime in a woman's hand as she stirs rice without coughing. Proof that self-reliance doesn't need a flag-waving ceremony. It just needs one working unit. Then 10. Then thousands. What Rasco Baba unleashed wasn't just economic, it was emotional. It reset what people believed was possible. And in that reset, something bigger woke up. Delegations came. Not with contracts, but with notebooks. Tanzania, Guinea, Mali, Gabon. They didn't come as buyers, they came to learn. The factory floor became a classroom. The product became policy. The movement became regional. Plans were drawn for sister factories across the Sahel, not as copy-paste projects, but as shared ownership, shared effort, shared pride. And here's the twist no one expected. The more local it stayed, the more global it became. A grandmother in a clay home in Koudougou used the same boiler as a chef in Doha, prepping for a Gulf state banquet. A student in Bobo Dioulasso fixed a valve his cousin in Marseille would cook with. And the words made in Burkina Faso, once overlooked, became something to look for. It's strange how power moves. Sometimes it's loud, sometimes it hums beneath the lid of a pressure pot. But when that hum spreads from market to market, from hand to hand, from kitchen to continent, you realize this was never just about a machine. It was about a map, a new way to trace how a nation moves forward. Not in headlines, not in donations, but in small, repeated acts of doing what others assumed you couldn't. We used to think Africa needed saving. Then this factory reminded us maybe all it needed was room. Room to weld, room to test, room to prove. And once you give people that, what they build doesn't just feed a home, it feeds history. We didn't make this video to glorify a machine, or a man, or a government. We made it because it's hard to ignore what's happening. When something real starts working where the world didn't expect it to. And maybe that's what this content is about. Not hype, not headlines, just context. And sometimes contradiction. Because yes, Burkina Faso still faces challenges. And yes, one factory doesn't fix a nation, but still something shifted. And once that shift begins, it's hard to unsee. Personally, I think it's one of the clearest case studies we've seen in a long time on what happens when belief meets structure. I guess it's not perfect. Nothing is. But in my point of view, it's more honest than most of what gets airtime. So if you're into stories that feel undercovered, but maybe underestimated, you're in the right place. You know what to do. Hit that bell. Drop your thoughts in the comments, not to debate, just to think together. And if this made you feel something, curious, challenged, even conflicted, that's a good sign. Stay with us. We've got another news story coming soon. One you probably won't hear anywhere else. Till then, keep watching, keep asking, and above all, keep paying attention.